chart for the following, well, for many reasons, but for one reason in particular. If you look at the media coverage of COVID, it's a bit like media coverage of politics. You want to focus on the worst possible excesses. So you don't actually notice the other stuff that's going on. And this is true of commentary around East Central Europe in general, right? We talk about the Germans, the Italians, the whole lot. But, you know, there's a rather large number of people who live in the rest of Europe, which geographically constitutes most of Europe, and they have a very different set of things going on. Now, with that in mind, let's start off with COVID, because the thing that caught my eye, and this is changing as we know, and this is just to get us into the conversation, was the way that COVID has differentially affected Western Europe versus Central and Eastern Europe. So let me just give everybody some numbers that I checked out this morning just to to get us set up here. So France has 183,000 cases and 28,000 dead. Romania, in contrast, 18,000 cases, 1,200 dead. Spain has 68,000 cases, 8,000 dead. Bulgaria, 2,400 and 136 dead. Ukraine, a very big country, 22,000 cases, 679 dead. And Estonia, a very small country, only 1,800 cases and 67 dead. So there's tremendous variation here. But the basic story is this part of the world seems to have not been hit as hard. That may change. We don't know how it's going on. But my first question to you is, what do you think's driving that? Was it the speed of the lockdowns? Was it something to do with the fact of the politics or the way these countries are organized? Give us your beam on why they got away with it early.
Yeah, I mean, I think the basic answer to the numbers as you've cited them, and I think there are some reasons to suspect that they're different in some places and maybe changing in others, is the rapid lockdown. And I mean, in all of these places by mid-March, mid to late March, there were stay-at-home orders, which included, you know, you had to have a written permit to go out to do anything. So pretty draconian. Some places, I mean, the Romanians apparently in the first few days of the lockdown collected in fines the equal to the annual yield of the corporate income tax. So they were going after people quite aggressively. But you know, from Albania to Latvia, these lockdown orders were put in place very fast, very seriously, and generally complied with by the populations. The more interesting question is, why were the lockdowns put in place so fast? And there, I think the answer is more complicated, and I'm not sure. One thing I think is going on in some of these countries anyway, the expertise of the World Bank or the UN or the World Health Organization or even the IMF was taken quite seriously, in the sense like, if you don't do this now, you're going to be in real trouble, and we know it, and you do it. And you know, if you look at the Western Balkans, I think that kind of reaction played a part. I also think, you know, these are countries that have had long and troubled histories, and, you know, the recognition of what an existential threat might be is perhaps more in the forefront of people's minds than where they know they're skating on thin ice, and that they haven't really, you know, there isn't, in many of these countries, the new normality is pretty fragile and people know it. So
right.
Disturbing that equilibrium was something nobody really wanted to risk. I also think that in all of these countries, though, in some of them or many of them, we're seeing the same kinds of polarization trends as we see in Western Europe and the States. The polarization has not yet undermined the scientific community. Experts in domains like public health are not immediately considered, partisans who've got an axe to grind. They're considered experts, and you listen to them when they speak. So for all those reasons, I think the lockdowns came hard and fast. And, whether that's something to, that was obviously a good thing, right? Mm-hmm. But I think the more interesting question, and I think it's the more interesting question for everybody, is, how we're going to dance with this disease going forward, and whether these countries will be able to dance with it,
right,
and effectively open up. But that's perhaps the second part of the conversation.
Yeah, one of the sort of explanations I've seen for this goes along with what you're saying, but as if you will, an adjunct to it, which is that when you have a fractured healthcare system, then you don't want to have to rely on it. So that basically has everybody's incentives aligned to basically go with the lockdown because you don't want to end up in the hospital. One of the places where that was probably particularly acute, at least it was a few years ago, was Romania, because Romania was basically the net supplier of doctors to the British National Health Service for a while. Has that situation improved? Have these health systems become more robust in the recent past?
The healthcare sector in most of post-communist Europe, perhaps with the exception of the Czechs and the Slovaks and the Slovenes, is pretty weak, pretty to very weak. So I think it is clear, yes, certainly in the Balkans, certainly in Poland and Hungary, there were concerns by medical experts raised very early that, we cannot afford to be overwhelmed. So, and in that sense, again, the voice of experts and of the healthcare professionals were listened to by the politicians in ways that in many places they didn't want to hear. So, for instance, in Poland, early on, there was a kind of pretty evident conflict between the Catholic Church, which wanted to continue to hold masses, mm-hmm. and the medical community, which said, this is nuts. And the government, whose political base is very closely tied to a certain sector of the Catholic population in Poland, ultimately went with the medical experts, and not with the church. And they didn't close the churches entirely, but they limited attendance at Mass to low numbers.
Right. One other explanation that I've seen, which I'm going to quote now from the economist Branko Milanovic, who's a Serb, is the following. And he basically says, you could have this good news story in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, relatively speaking, but don't expect anybody to pay attention to it. And here's his quote. I want to read it and then see what you think of this. Quote, "It comes on the heels of 30 years of lecturing. Whenever you read anything on Eastern Europe, it's something bad. Look at us, they say in the West. We are great and you guys are awful. And then you have a major crisis where people die and the lecturers are in total disarray and the lectured ones do better. Shouldn't there be more reflection on why? That is to say, is it more than they just got lucky? Is there something else going on here that other countries could actually learn from?"
I agree with Branko's general sentiments.
Right.
I'm not sure he's right in this case. I think they got a little lucky in the sense that, there was less international travel going on. There are some interesting paired comparisons that are worth making. Slovenia, Slovakia, and Austria, for instance, are kind of obvious ones where the Slovenes and the Slovakians have done better than the Austrians, who are considered to have done pretty well. Mm-hmm. But again, I think and I haven't gone into the details about, the precise dates and nature of the lockdowns, but the one thing that most of Eastern Europe did very fast was to shut down movement and to make it, to cut down exposure as fast.
Right. So they were also quite fast, particularly in some countries, to use masks. And masks don't seem to have become politicized in the way that they have in other countries, despite, as you were saying, there's a polarization in these countries as well. Are there kind of, emergent freedom fighter insurgencies in these countries as well, or have they largely escaped that?
Well, no, ironically, the anti-lockdown protests seem to be emerging precisely as these countries are opening up, sort of with a lag time. And the mask debate is and the symbolism of it, I think in a lot of places is not too different from what it is here. So, the members of the ruling party in Poland are pretty loath to show up in masks. They don't do it at the same time as requiring everybody to wear them on the streets and so on. So, but in recent days in Serbia, I think, in Poland for sure, there have been organized street protests. In Poland, the police broke them up with tear gas against the lockdown and demanding a faster implementation of opening up procedures, which are already going on. And I should add, in Poland, the Poles have done pretty well. Let me forget what the numbers are, but the overall rate, the death rates have fallen, but they've fallen primarily in Warsaw, and they're rising quite dramatically in Śląsk, in Silesia. And the Poles never closed down the coal mines. And there's a serious fear that they don't have it as much in control as they're claiming, and that Silesia may now be cordoned off to prevent the spread of the disease further. They're beginning to close mines. It's also very interesting. I mean, there's the whole debate about what will coronavirus do for climate change, and the ironies and paradoxes of that in Poland are completely weird. So they've kept the mines open, but the demand, of course, for energy has dropped like a stone. So those huge surpluses of coal, and at the same time, it's cheaper to import coal from Colombia. So it's just a
huge weird nonlinear effects of the whole thing.
Right. So it's all of that. Yeah. Okay. So Poland has had 23,000 cases, 10,000 recovered, 1,000 deaths. So again, pretty well. The numbers, the people, I've read some stuff about Romania where they say that despite the relatively low deaths, it would be easy to overwhelm that system still.
Yeah.
So they're on, the Poles, I think, are in a little better shape. Romania was famous for having a terrible health care.
Right. So let's talk about the politics that's going on under the guise of this. You've been mentioning Poland. Let's switch to the one that gets a bit more attention, which is Hungary. So Orban, if you believe the press reports, has basically declared himself El Presidente for life, more or less. And,
until yesterday. Until
yesterday, right. So what's going on? Give me the rundown, because I literally don't understand what's going
on. Okay, I'm not sure I know essentially early on, sometime in early April or late March, Orban issued an emergency decree, like many of the countries did, which gave the government essentially veto powers over everything and anything. But the novelty here was that it had no end date. So it was like a standard emergency decree package with an infinite end date. And the fear was that he was going to use this as a way to keep consolidating power, over which he's pretty consolidated. A few days ago, they amended the decree, or are in the process of amending the decree and giving it an end date. And now the debate is, was this all Machiavellian, that we're going to, scare the out of everybody and then back off, or whether it's a response to some EU pressure, of which there has been some. But the end result is it looks like now the emergency decree will have an end date. I should say in the interim, they've also, one of the more interesting things, going back to the success of these countries and what it'll mean going forward to dance with the disease, and I don't have a complete inventory, but many of them also put in place social welfare packages that provided cash payments to households to carry them over. Some places this was fairly significant, in other places I'm sure it didn't happen, but there's been a recognition the government it's not just a healthcare problem. That extends beyond that. In Hungary, there has been a lot of noise about the stimulus package going to all of Orban's cronies, and in particular, his using it to buy out, or to have friends buy out a few of the last remaining independent media organizations. So that's there. The Polish situation looked similar, and so the Poles were supposed to have an election for the presidency on May 10th. And initially the ruling coalition wanted to push those elections through at the same time as they were calling for a lockdown. It smelled and looked like Wisconsin. But interestingly enough, within the ruling coalition, one of the minority parties said, no, we can't do this. And we can't, the government wanted to have an all mail-in vote. And there was a constitutional crisis about how can you postpone the elections and so on. Eventually, they resolved it by agreeing that the Constitutional Court will recognize the elections that didn't take place on May 10th as invalid, and that the elections will be postponed, right? But there are elections coming up across the region, and everywhere there are accusations that the incumbents are using the crisis to improve their chances of winning. So this is going on in Macedonia and in Serbia. The opposition is getting nervous about, it's all the premier all the time, the prime minister all the time talking about this stuff. Nobody's getting any other airtime. Money is flowing to organizations that support them and so on. So that's a downstream, but the two most obvious cases of existing governments using the crisis or trying to use the crisis to strengthen their current hands are Poland and Hungary, and I think more successfully in Hungary than in Poland.
Right. So let's talk about migration across borders in this period, because we think of these lockdowns as everybody stays at home, but Eastern European populations are quite mobile and are quite dispersed in unique ways. So I'm going to throw a couple of things out. Our friend Cornel Ban, who used to be at Brown, who's now at Copenhagen Business School, wrote this wonderful piece for the Danish daily Politiken, pointing out the hypocrisy of Western European leaders regarding Eastern European migration, not just the Brexit crowd, but all of them. An example he gave was, he called them the asparagus regiments. So basically, the Germans love their asparagus, particularly the white stuff, the Weisspargel. Whoops, there we go. And it turns out, though, that like most places in Europe and the US, the native population doesn't pick this stuff. It's migrant labor. So they lifted the lockdowns that they had and chartered special planes and flew thousands of Romanians in close proximity to each other to basically, you know, bring home the asparagus, which they duly did, but it concentrated cases of COVID amongst these migrants, which then brought them back to Romania, right? So there's a kind of a blowback there. Another one is the way that Ukrainian workers are integrated into the sort of unofficial side of the healthcare regimes in countries like Italy, but also countries like Poland. And again, these people are very fragile and mobile across these borders. Is that something that's especially dangerous for these countries going forward, these types of vulnerable populations?
Yeah, I think that's a hidden level of stuff that we don't think about for that part of the world, which we are living within America in very obvious ways, right? And you know, Eastern European, you talked about Ukrainians in Poland, but so there are Eastern Europeans in Western Europe, and then there are Eastern Europeans in quote in Eastern Europe in big numbers. We're talking about, you know, somewhere between 1 million and 2 million Ukrainians in Poland on any given day, and they play critical roles in at least two obvious pieces of the economy. One is in the food supply system, like here, where immigrants and migrants are critically important. And the other is in domestic care work. And in most of these countries, not only are the health care systems not as robust as elsewhere, but elderly care and assisted living is on the margins of people's consciousness. And most elderly care is done at home or done at home or done in homes staffed with migrant labor. I'll put in a plug for my daughter, who just works on this stuff in Warsaw, and just wrote a piece about Ukrainian migrant women in Poland who play this kind of critical role in the Polish care system. How big a role, nobody knows, because there are no good data, and there's not good data on it. But you have, you know, women working in multiple homes, living in crowded conditions, often with each other. So there's an interesting question about, as my daughter put it, these migrants as both vectors of the disease and as critical components in combating it. And the debate about these issues in Eastern Europe per se is pretty much at its infancy, though to their credit, the Poles, I mean, it's kind of an ambiguous story, kind of funny story. The Poles have said that all COVID related treatment and testing is free for anybody in the country. Then apparently, when they've done outreach efforts to Ukrainians and other in the country, the Vietnamese population in Czech, it would be interesting to look at. There was also a Vietnamese population in Poland. They've done some outreach about the disease, but in the outreach, they didn't include the fact that they were now welcome with open arms into the healthcare system. They have also not extended economic relief to informal workers, so they're not getting the extra payment.
So We're getting close to the half hour. I'm going to start bringing in some of the questions we've had from the chat. So the first one is directly relevant to this, and this is kind of why I brought this one in. So this is from Names. It's a very strange name. His name. Sorry, Names or Namias. I'm not sure I'm getting this right. Anyway, could some places have done without a lockdown just because there's low international traffic? Some argue, though, that those with more traffic were more affected. And that's why I was pressing on the migration issue. In a sense, is the possible vector for this spiking in this region these internal migration patterns, rather than, for example, someone flying in from a place that's a hotspot?
Are you talking about now or in the future?
In the future, going forward. Or rather,
I mean,
did they get lucky simply because they don't get as many visitors? And is the problem going forward that you're going to have a lot of people like Ukrainians coming back home if these economies are very shocked, et cetera, et cetera?
you know, I think that as things open up, and that's the dance, it's going to be interesting to see, you know, yeah, we need the agricultural workers, we need the domestic workers. Do we have an inclusive strategy in terms of informing and providing health and social services for them or not? And I think it's going to be ultimately extremely difficult. Well, I guess the tracing will tell you, but to know whether it's people flying in from abroad or people circulating within that's producing the outbreaks. But in all of these places, well, not in Poland, Ukraine, Hungary, Romania, the overall rates are stabilizing or falling, but there are still hotspots.
Right.
Are worth, and the Ukrainian numbers, I should have said in the beginning, are hard to know because it is almost, you can almost bet on it that the hardest hit regions are Donetsk and Lugansk,
Right.
which, by the way, have, you know, the highest AIDS and drug-resistant tuberculosis rates in the world.
Wow.
And where the healthcare system is fallen, and where neither Putin's Russia nor the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian with better justification, can do much inside. So the reporting and the rates there are probably, it's a train wreck we're probably waiting to happen.
Waiting to happen. Speaking of that part of the world, let's extend it beyond where we are. Let's talk about Russia for a bit. So what's your read on Russia in this whole crisis?
That's a train wreck that's happened, but nobody's talking about it yet.
Yeah, that's odd, isn't it? I mean, it really is a train wreck, but it's just not getting the publicity. What's up with that?
I mean, I think there are sort of like 400,000 cases reported, and the Russian government, you know, says we're doing all these cases, and we have the lowest fatality rate. We only have, you know, a fraction of 4,000 deaths or something out of 400,000 cases, which is absurd on its face. Meanwhile, you know, doctors who have reported that they're operating with no equipment have fallen out of windows, and even some of, I think the municipal governments of St. Petersburg and Moscow have both, you know, sort of explicitly demanded greater protect PPE because they're saying they're getting none of it. So, and they've been, you know, there are reports coming out that they've been told to report only cases of coronavirus where it is clearly the only thing involved.
Right.
Right. So the suspicion is that the death rate is much, 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 much higher than being reported, and that they have really done little to control it. And Putin, by the way, is playing the same three-card Monte game as Trump, saying, on the one hand, I'm not responsible, it's the regional governments.
Right, on to them.
And if something's wrong, it's their problem. And apparently, you know, he came on, the last conversation of this was a Zoom conversation, which instead of having everybody appear as in the Brady Bunch little boxes screen. It was a Russian Orthodox cross in which he was the centerpiece, and the regional governors were spread out up above, and he from the center was shaking his fingers at all of them.
Wow. So given the fact that the more authoritarian regimes tend to basically draw their legitimacy to the extent that they have some from basically economic performance. It's what the Czechs used to call salamis for submission back in the day, right?
Right.
Is this a threat to someone like Putin? Could this really finally crack it?
Well, I mean, a combination between the, crash in the world oil price,
right,
and pretending that this isn't happening, and the real threat that it is gonna not only happening, but it's gonna happen in a mushroom cloud kind of way in a 6 to 8 weeks, is I think they're very nervous. And the poll numbers, if you can believe the Levita Institute's polling, which is an independent agency, is that Putin's approval rating is the lowest it's been since he took office. So
right.
It's not a happy story there. Not a happy story. Meanwhile, the propaganda about, this is caused by the West, and, our death rates are much lower because we have a better healthcare system than all of this is going
on. All right, going back to Eastern Europe for a bit, the way that I tend to understand our region as a whole, let's bring the EU into this, is this is going to lead to 2 questions. So the first one is, basically, I went to Romania on vacation 2 summers ago. I had a great time. And I went to Hermannstadt, or CBU, as it's called, and all this wonderful places. And you see a kind of relative to the rest of to Western Europe, to Southern Europe in particular, these are boom times. Right? There's a lot of investment. There's a lot of jobs. The Romanian minimum wage increased 3 times, if not, I think maybe possibly 4 times over the past decade. The migration flows have stopped going out. There's actually some in-migration now. And, good times are ahead. Now, all of this is contingent upon being part of the kind of supply chain for the German export complex, which is reliant upon selling BMWs to the Americans and the Chinese. Now, if a combination of basically Trump, China, plus COVID kills the export sector of Germany, that's not going to bid too well for these countries. If that happened, how would you see that economic shock translating into politics around the region? You like that one then?
Yeah, I like that one. Yeah, I mean, that's none of these countries has yet to produce a viable or a serious center-left social democratic alternative. Very few of them have. So the fear would be if the world economy disintegrates and the German engine of Eastern European growth stalls, I think you get a very ugly brown-shirted reaction everywhere. I think it's possible that something else could emerge, but the go at it alone, the vilification of the neighbor, the vilification of the EU, and the EU as, Brussels is really Berlin, and they're responsible for all our woes, at least using the Polish discourse as the one that I'm closest to. It could get pretty ugly pretty fast.
Well, let's hope that doesn't come to pass. More positively, the Baltics, a bit like New Zealand and Australia, have agreed a little travel bubble between them. And that doesn't seem to be, too politically problematic to do that. The Danes have done it with, who is it now? It's not the Swedes, but they did it with somebody else, right? So there's beginning to be these pockets of opening up. Why do you think it's easier for some countries to do this? It's not just the numbers of, the relative numbers of infections they're talking about. It seems to be less, this is again a question that's coming on the chat, there seems to be less politicization of opening up. Is that fair, or is it just like, just the samples we're looking at just now?
Well, okay, so in the last few days, I think the Slovaks and the Slovenian, there are other bubbles going on, including some loosening between the Poles and the Hungarians and the Poles. So the bubbles are happening, and they're kind of tentative, and some of them are coming with 2-day stay periods. Some of them are coming with foreign EU nationals can come in without quarantine. I think that's the Slovenia rule, and but non-EU nationals have to go through the quarantine. So it will be easier for the Baltics, who always in some sense see themselves as a separate group, and in this case have been almost all have low levels to do this. There's been some movements, strangely enough, in the Balkans also to open up borders. I think most of that is being driven by less political affinities or profound love, but a desire to kind of figure out how much we can open up, and the need to try and figure out, get back some trade and some openings, since a lot of right. So I'm not sure. I think it's either politically robust or stable or motivated by profound affinities more than it is by kind of common need to think about how do we dance with the disease, as I said, going.
How do we get on from this point? Absolutely. So you're just going to pull some more questions off of here. Can you comment on the harshness of the lockdowns as a function of distrust between the state and citizens and among citizens themselves? I suppose the implicit claim, the hypothesis there, if we want to treat it that way, is that the harsher the lockdown, the lower the trust, with Sweden being the counterexample. I'm going to individualize the response, go home and take care of it. Think that's fair?
That's an interesting question. So there's the Albanian lockdown, the Romanian lockdowns were draconian, came with heavy penalties and so on, and the level of trust between the government and the people is low. Mm-hmm. But I'm not entirely. I think the heavy-handedness of the lockdowns were really motivated by the fear of the politicians that if this gets out of hand, they're finished. Right. And I'm not sure. I think that the heavy-handedness of the lockdowns really had that much to do with compliance early on, because what was kind of shocking about this everywhere is the degree to which people complied, even beyond the what was being legally required, because for a moment it looked like an existential threat that required this kind of behavior. So I don't know. It's an interesting idea. You could look whether there was a direct relationship. I mean, it might be that in countries where the governments know they're hated, they made the punishments more draconian. Yes. Whether that was really what explained how the compliance, as I said, I'm not sure.
Yeah, how they got to it, exactly. So within the sort of the core of the EU, there has been now this much trumpeted, we'll see if there's any real substance to it, European Recovery Fund. What's been the Eastern European response, if anything, to that? Because essentially, it's been a conversation about whether the Swedes and the Dutch are going to allow the Germans to give the Italians some money. But in actual fact, this involves a whole variety of other countries that are possible veto players, or alternatively might see this as a good thing. Has there been any reaction to that amongst these countries? How are they playing this card?
Well, I don't know much except the Poles, and the Poles are doing their usual two-step and saying, yeah, we're interested in it, but we want to know how much we're going to have to put in and how much we're going to get
out.
Right. So, and somebody, wait a minute. Oh, you know who? The star performer, actually, it's sort of worth saying this, I guess, though it's not Eastern Europe. The poor man's hero of this piece so far seems to be Portugal.
Yeah.
In a lot of interesting ways. And the Portuguese not only, did the lockdown intelligently, but they immediately said anybody who's in the country has full medical health care services. They extended the economic relief to everybody in the country. And now, going back to which is why I thought about it, going back to the question you just asked, they are hoping to use the EU monies to support municipal and local government efforts to create exit strategies and contact tracing systems and the like. So for some interesting reason, the Portuguese have been thinking ahead of this game more than anybody else.
Yeah. Somebody else who's done quite well in this, comparatively speaking, of course, is also Greece.
Yeah. Yeah. Though again, I think the Greeks, how much the Greeks know they've been living on the edge, and if they didn't,
yeah, they knew they couldn't afford to get whacked. Right. I think that's exactly what's driving them. That's totally it. So here's one. So the Spanish, again, to go back to my opening comments, right? We only care about the noisiest news, right? So it's Trump's tweets, right? That's what gets the news every rather than actual stuff that's going on. So people tend to forget there's a left-wing populism as well as a right-wing populism. And the left-wing populism in Spain is in the government. And they've just introduced the universal basic income. Like, this has actually happened. And it's just going completely under the radar, right? Do you think there would be any room for that type of sort of radical policy shakeup in any of the Eastern countries? Is there an appetite for that, or movements that would want to see that type of thing?
I don't see the left strong enough anywhere to do it on its own. I can see a few places where, Serbia, where a kind of shrewd Bismarckian, Disraelian strategy of consolidating power through the extension of something like universal basic income could be proposed and accepted by the population at the same time as kind of muting the opposition. Most other places, I don't, maybe Slovenia, okay, there's a left-wing version of that. Conceivably Slovakia, as far as I know. I don't know enough about Bulgaria to say Ukraine couldn't afford it. The Poles wouldn't do it.
Yeah, just not going to happen. Yeah, so not so much fertile ground. The standard story on this is that, coming out of the post-communist period, a fear of big states, a fear of statism, an eager embrace of the market. There's the Cornell Band story of essentially importing people who have been trained in, let's say, extremely market-friendly institutions and then dumped into finance ministries, etc. But usually these things kind of have a maturation process. Usually there's a kind of generational effect. I can actually imagine my wife is from East Germany, right? So I totally get it with her family, right? Basically they come out of it and they're like, we're not going back to that crap, right? But after 25 years of untrammeled markets, it didn't even take that long for Ostalgie to start coming back in East Germany, right? There doesn't seem to be much Ostalgie there. It really still seems to be a kind of anti-statism. Is that fair? Or do people like Orban show that that's really not the case?
Well, I think there's a nationalistic statism that is there. I just don't think it's a social democratic one. The statism has an ambiguous relationship to some markets and is more ready to step in ways. And the Polish ruling party, for instance, very shrewdly came in and instituted a child support policy that was far to the left of anything that had been introduced before, and has indeed shored up their base quite strongly. And I think they will continue to cater to their base that way. But a universal basic income would be a step too far for a part of the world that still thinks that, work and deservedness go pretty hand in hand together.
So 40 years of existing socialism didn't really get rid of that one then?
No, it just a lot of bad jokes.
In fact, it was probably reinforced.
Right, exactly.
Right. We're going exactly the opposite way from that one. Here's an interesting question that's come in. Has disinformation and or efforts to be more resilient to disinformation played any role in the Eastern European response to the COVID crisis? So basically, are they swimming in a sea of nonsense on Facebook like we are, or are they not? And does that help?
I don't know enough, and I haven't been following it enough to really say. Again, I think the public health authorities have had a more prominent place and a more prominent voice in this and that's in at least the Polish case held up pretty well, whether it's fraying at the edges now and the demands to open up quickly and this is all too much and it's a tempest in a teapot. There are those forces brewing. How vicious they will become and what'll happen if there's a second peak or a second wave is really hard to say.
Not fair. Do you know anything at all about the place that no one ever talks about? Which is
Belarus,
yeah, Belarus, right? Exactly. I didn't know. I was going to say Belarus. It's like I completely forgotten Belarus existed. Right? Where is Belarus in all this?
And I'm embarrassed to say I don't. I should. I should. So no, I can't really say.
We literally can't say anything about that.
No, but it is a kind of criminal offense because it is the definition of the place that nobody remembers.
Yes, it is exactly, and
it is caught between Russia and Eastern Europe in a way, and overshadowed by what's going on in Ukraine. I don't know. I really don't know.
Let's talk about a place you do know then, Ukraine. So how's that? They were in bad shape already for multiple reasons. There was a debt crisis, there was a war, there's deliberate destabilization of Russia, there's ambiguous support from the EU and the United States. Then they elect a guy who was literally playing the president on television.
Right.
How's that all working out?
It's not working out brilliantly. The hopes that were invested in the Zelensky government at the beginning have not been fulfilled. The government has gone through a couple of, at least one major reshuffling. Then just after that reshuffling was made, the virus hit. It's done pretty well with the virus. It also reacted quickly and strongly, and at least the official number of deaths and the number of recorded cases is low. There are pockets. I mean, Kiev is a hot spot in the Donetsk Oblast, for reasons that I don't understand, is also a hot spot, and that may be problematic going forward. And then, of course, as I said, nobody knows what's going on in the Donbass, and it's a good bet that it ain't good. you know, I think the IMF, strangely, has been a pretty good actor in all of this for a while.
Mhm.
That they more than anybody.
Yeah. When your most reliable friend is the IMF, you know you're in a weird world.
Yes, but I mean the IMF has been relatively, has I think been generous and forthcoming, and I'm not entirely sure of this, but they may have gotten forgiveness on the most recent tranche of payments that they were supposed to make because of the crisis, and new loans have been extended. So, and they are very hugely dependent on exports, particularly agricultural exports. So, if the world doesn't reopen again, they're going to be in deeper problems than they are. What else can I say? I mean, the government is continuing with a set of reforms across a number of important fronts that I think is kind of remarkable and admirable. They've adapted to, governance by Zoom pretty well, and there's.
We have governance by Twitter, so they're straight ahead already.
But so things haven't completely gone off the wagon. I really think the more telling. I hate to do it. The more telling information will be about how well people dance with this, and that will show where social trust really works. That will show where intergovernmental coordination works. That will show
where your fiscal plumbing works,
the way the fiscal plumbing works, or how it's been tweaked. And this American game of the Trump blaming the states and the locals for everything, and the states and the locals saying, you got to step in. That will get more intense, and that will get more intense for the European Union as well. That's going to be another interesting.
That is going to be. We're just about running out of time. I'm going to ask you one question, which is kind of a silly question, but I think it could be quite insightful. If you had to spend the next year in any Eastern or Central European country, which one would it be and why?
Probably Slovenia.
Rich lefties with vineyards.
Rich lefties with vineyards, beaches, and ski slopes.
Yeah, they did actually. When they pulled away from Yugoslavia, they took some of the best bits with them. There's no doubt about that one.
Slovenia is always a nice place to go. Ljubljana is one of the more charming cities in the world, and they've got a lot of, for a small place, a nice variety of real estate assets, and they're generally sensible and kind.
I've heard them referred to as the Costa Rica of Eastern Europe.
Yeah, there's another phrase about them having the souls of Eastern Europeans, the work habits of Germans, and the design spirit of Italians, or something like this. It's
so we know where we'll find you.
You could do worse. Yes.
Excellent. All right. Well, we'll have to cut up at that point. Thanks to everyone for all the questions. We didn't get to all of them. Many of them weren't directly linked to what we were talking about, so that's probably why we wouldn't ask some of them. But thanks to everybody for taking part. It's been great to chat to you. Most informative, Tony. I wish you well in future travels, to the extent that you're allowed to travel this summer.
All right. No, this summer probably not, but thank you, and it's been fun, and we should do this more often.
Absolutely. Until soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Ciao, ciao.